vaccination campaign in history is underway, with over 1 billion COVID-19 vaccines having been administered worldwide. The AIDS Healthcare Foundation is now demanding there be international collaboration to vaccinate our world against COVID-19. It's urged world leaders, vaccine manufacturers and public health organizations to vow to protect humanity. That's by providing equal access to COVID-19 vaccines worldwide, especially in lower income countries. Now, some countries have yet to give anyone the jab. Africa has the slowest vaccination rate of any continent at the moment. Let's chat more about this now with Dr. Penina Eartung. She's Africa Bureau Chief from the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Doctor, very good morning. Thanks so much for your help, for your time. Tell us more about what it is you're asking the world to help with when it comes to vaccinations. What is your call? Because, I mean, we've heard this call from the time we heard vaccinations were available, and you have to wonder why you still have to make this call.
Yes, I think it's very important that we should not keep quiet, as you have laid it out. There is a lot of inequity between the developed world and the developing world when it comes to vaccine access. Of the 1.3 billion doses of vaccines that have been administered, only 0.3% have actually been administered in the developing world. And of that number in Africa, the numbers are even much less. You know, in terms of people who have accessed vaccines, it's less than 25 million people. So if we look at how the virus works, we know that none of us is going to be safe for as long as we are not all vaccinated, or at least a large pool of the world is vaccinated enough to achieve herd immunity. So currently, we know Africa is lagging behind, severely lagging behind. It's been 6 months since these vaccines were announced, and that gave a ray of hope to the world that we were finally going to see an end in the near future to this pandemic, or at least to get control of the pandemic. But 4 months later, 4 months much later, after the mass vaccination was rolled out in most of the developed world, Africa is terribly lagging behind. And this provides, of course, a lot of uncertainty. As of yesterday, I think you must have seen the news as well, that the Serum Institute of India, which is the largest global producer of vaccines, was going to stop exporting vaccines until the end of the year. And they were going to prioritize India, keeping the vaccines basically at home to take care of their population. And that said, we've seen the same thing happen, in the rest of the Western world. It's appalling to see that a place like the UK has more than 4 times the amount of vaccine that it needs. Canada more than 5 times. That list is going on, and there's a lot of restriction to vaccine access. So I know that the WHO set up, WHO with the partners like Gavi and CEPI, they set up the COVAX initiative. The COVAX initiative is basically to ensure that there's, equitable access and easier access for vaccines for the developing world, for most of the developing world, and also to provide it free, as much as possible, to provide it free. But the COVAX initiative is really limping. It's been slow to deliver the vaccines, and even if it's been slow, the quantities have been very limited. Less than 30 million doses have been delivered so far.
So who needs to take the lead?
So that alone shows you that we are not towards reaching out to any of the goals about controlling this pandemic for as long as the inequity continues. So for us, we know that
if I can just jump in there, sorry, if I can just jump in there, then who needs to take the lead to make sure, let's talk Africa specifically, who needs to take the lead then to make sure that we do get the access that is needed to these vaccines for the continent? I mean, we can't obviously look to Western powers or to help us out. Who needs to take the lead here, and what needs to be done?
Yeah, it is our governments, but also it is our own communities and all the voices. The number one is, I would say, is our governments and the regional bodies as well. I think at this point in time, a number of governments have reached out. They've reached out to using the regional bodies like the AU. The AU has actually been very instrumental in trying to get procure vaccines from manufacturers directly. Governments, I know the South African government and a number of other governments have actually put money aside and procured, some vaccines. But even where the money has been available, and most governments I know are looking for, funds within their budgets to procure these vaccines, they can't actually access them. And that's a big, and that's actually a big problem, because there are already long pre-orders that have been placed by most of the developed countries with these manufacturers. So Africa is actually coming in at the tail end. I don't think at this point in time we are being prioritized over orders from the developed world. Yeah. And so even when we have the money and our governments have put aside that money, we actually cannot access it. Well, so it's important that yes.
Dr. Yetung, I also read an article yesterday about, activists sort of describing or outing those who've made billions, those who've become billionaires because of this vaccination manufacturing process. And it seems, yes, profits seem to have overtaken sort of saving lives. It has happened, despite all the warnings that this would happen when we heard that a vaccine would be made available. Now, I see also your organization, AHF, also calling for some kind of pandemic treaty to be drawn up so that we can ensure that this happens. How far do you think that would go to sort of solving the problems when it comes to access to vaccinations, especially here for the continent, and also to sort of, just stem the profit-making that seems to be abounding in this process?
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of pharmaceutical greed, not just with the vaccines, but in past history also with ARV medications. That has happened before. We see a lot of pharma greed when it comes to new medications, for instance, for hepatitis C. They find the price of treatment for some of the hep C drugs can be as high as $80,000. That's just ridiculous. So the pharma greed has to be stymied in one way or another, whether it is by some international treaty, I think, which would be helpful. I can give the example of AIDS. If generic drugs were not made available and if international property rights were not waived to ensure that generic drug could be produced by countries like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, if that had not been made possible, Africa, I think, would have seen many more deaths before being able to access ARV drugs. And so right now we are seeing the same scenario where profits are being placed over people's lives. Why would one company want to give massive bonuses in a period when people are dying, there's a pandemic, and they're receiving massive bonuses? Why isn't that money being used to help humanity at the end of the day? Is it that some lives are more important than the other? You ask yourself all these questions. But the pharma greed has to be stymied, and it can only be stymied if there's an international treaty that ensures that cannot happen again. But at this point in time, we see that we do not have that, as yet. And so it seems like we do not learn from previous history. We do not learn, we do not learn as a world, as a global, as a global village. And yet we cannot continue to have many more lives at risk. Because at this point in time, even the European lives are also at risk, because for as long as Africa remains unvaccinated, we'll continue to produce new variants. So even if the vaccines have been vaccinated right now and those vaccines are working for the current variants, we've seen that different variants, the virus is clever. It's trying to survive. So there are different variants that that are forming. Okay. And will those variants still be susceptible to those same vaccines? We don't know. Yeah. So it doesn't help if Europe is Europe and the Western and the US and the other countries in the Western world are vaccinated and Africa is not. That's why if we are to achieve pandemic control, we all have to have a high level of vaccination, across the world. It has to be equitable.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. We'll leave it there for now. Dr. Piniana Yetung, Africa Bureau Chief from the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. They're just on equal access. Vaccinate Our World. Vow. That is their call to action. Well,